Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com, and welcome to our live coverage of SpaceX's launch of the Transporter 4 mission. This is SpaceX's fourth dedicated small satellite rideshare flight on a Falcon 9 rocket. Liftoff is a little over 1 hour away, targeted for 12:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's 16:24 UTC for those of you in other time zones. So launch is just over an hour away right now. There's an overcast cloud deck overhead over Florida's Space Coast right now. The latest forecast we saw from yesterday indicated there was just a 30% chance of favorable weather for launch during today's instantaneous opportunity. However, the rain showers that passed over the area overnight have moved south of Cape Canaveral. Currently, there's no rain or thunderstorms in the vicinity of the launch pad. However, those clouds overhead are being closely monitored at this time by the launch weather officer, and it does remain to be seen whether the weather will be acceptable for liftoff at 12:24 p.m. And we did just receive an update on the weather status this morning. The weather forecast probability has improved somewhat, with a 50% chance of favorable weather at this time for liftoff 1 hour from now at 12:24 p.m. Eastern Time. So that's a bit of an improvement over the forecast from yesterday. However, the weather does remain iffy, and we'll be monitoring that along with SpaceX. We'll pass along any updates we do receive on the weather throughout the rest of the countdown. And yet another update on the weather. The weather is very dynamic this morning, and in a good sense. The official weather forecast now calls for a 60% chance of favorable weather for liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket at 12:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 16:24 UTC. That's a little over 55 minutes away. The liftoff time is actually pegged for exactly 12:24 and 17 seconds Eastern Time. That's 16:24:17 UTC. Now 55 minutes away. You're looking at a live view of the Falcon 9 out on Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is readying the rocket remotely at this time from the Launch Control Center a few miles away from the pad. The start of propellant loading is scheduled to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. That is 20 minutes away. At that point, liquid oxygen and kerosene will begin loading into the Falcon 9 out at Pad 40. You'll see some ice and frost begin to build up on the skin of the Falcon 9 booster. That's due to the super cold nature of the liquid oxygen that's going to be loaded into the rocket. And you'll see vapors of gaseous oxygen appear around the vehicle and around that strong back structure to the right of the rocket. All that's normal. That'll be a venting of that cryogenic oxidizer throughout the rest of the countdown. Now inside of 50 minutes left to go until liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40. This mission is designated Transporter 4. It's the fourth dedicated small satellite rideshare mission for SpaceX. And on this mission, SpaceX is launching a grand total of 40 spacecraft. That includes individual satellites as well as a hosted payload that will not separate from its host spacecraft. So 40 payloads in total. They range in size from the size of a slice of bread up to the size of a small car. The biggest spacecraft on board is the INMAP, Environmental Mapping Satellite for the German Space Agency, or DLR. That's sitting on top of the payload stack on the Falcon 9. And below that is a package of 39 other payloads, smaller in size, also hitching a ride to orbit on the Falcon 9 rocket today. So now less than 49 minutes to go, about 14 minutes away from the start of propellant loading. now T-minus 33 minutes and 38 seconds. A little over a minute ago, we heard confirmation from SpaceX's launch team that propellant loading is underway. The rocket is being loaded with kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants at this time. Those propellants are being pumped into the first stage of the Falcon 9 out at Pad 40. Kerosene is now flowing into stage 2. Liquid oxygen will start loading into the second stage of the Falcon 9 at T-minus 16 minutes or so. So with the weather greatly improved, with a 60% chance of favorable conditions now for launch, SpaceX is pressing into the terminal countdown. The final 35 minutes of the countdown is governed by an automated sequencer overseeing the steps to load propellants as well as helium pressurant into the Falcon 9 rocket, as well as all the steps in the final minutes of the countdown to configure the various systems on the launch vehicle and pressurize its propellant tanks, and then send the command to light those 9 Merlin 1D engines at the bottom of the first stage. The Falcon 9's onboard computer will run those engines through a health check for a couple of seconds, and then some hydraulic clamps at the base of the pad will release to allow those engines to propel the Falcon 9 away from Pad 40 for its vertical climb into the sky, and then it'll head downrange to the southeast and eventually turning south, bound for polar orbit with 40 spacecraft on board. Now passing just inside of 24 minutes until liftoff. The clock just hit noon here on the east coast of Florida. Liftoff remains scheduled for 12:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 16:24 UTC. You're looking at a live view of the 229-foot or 70-meter tall Falcon 9 on Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Propellant loading is proceeding at this time. You can just barely see the first hints of frost building up on the bottom section of that first stage. That's from the liquid oxygen being loaded into the rocket at this time. That's being pumped into the Falcon 9 at the same time as kerosene is being loaded. Kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen will feed the Merlin engines for today's mission to space with 40 spacecraft on board. These images show what some of those spacecraft look like. On the left side is an image released by SpaceX showing the Transporter 4 stack. Those 40 spacecraft are being enclosed inside the Falcon 9's payload fairing in this view. At the top of that stack is INMAP, which is the German Environmental Mapping and Analysis Program spacecraft. That's the biggest spacecraft on board and the largest spacecraft SpaceX has ever launched on one of its rideshare missions, weighing in at about a ton. That's a hyperspectral imaging satellite that will be surveying vegetation, crops, and forests for scientists to study how they're doing and to assess their health and assess how their health is changing with seasons and years as the Earth's climate is changing over time. The image also shows a cluster of additional satellites on board, some smaller than INMAP, some ranging in size from the size of a slice of bread up to the size of a small washing machine. On the right side are a view of 3 Hawkeye 360 satellites. These satellites are from the commercial company Hawkeye 360, designed to geolocate and assess the source of radio transmitters around the world. These satellites join existing spacecraft already launched in Hawkeye's fleet. In fact, recently Hawkeye released data that it acquired over Ukraine a few weeks ago, showing how the company says that the Russian military is jamming GPS signals in the region amid its military invasion of the country. For today's mission, the Falcon 9 will head initially southeast from Space Launch Complex 40, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean. The red the red line in this view shows the approximate track of the first stage, and the green bar shows the approximate track of the second stage. So the Falcon 9 will initially head southeast, and after stage separation, the first stage will head downrange for landing on the drone ship Just Read the Instructions, parked between Cuba and the Bahamas, around 330 miles downrange from the Cape. The second stage will then perform a dogleg maneuver with a right turn to fly along the eastern coast of Florida, heading for a polar sun-synchronous orbit. This shows the launch hazard area for today's mission, showing where the range safety officials are telling boaters to keep out from passing under the ground track of the Falcon 9. Now, T-minus 20 minutes and 15 seconds. You're now seeing what's called the big vent in the Falcon 9 countdown, the gaseous oxygen being vented away from the strong back. This occurs when the second stage is fully loaded with kerosene fuel, and also marks the beginning of the chill down procedure to begin thermally conditioning liquid oxygen lines leading up to the second stage ahead of flowing that oxidizer into the stage 2 tank at T-minus 16 minutes. So this indicates the countdown is remaining on track for liftoff at 12:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 16:24 UTC. The second stage kerosene tank now fully loaded, the first of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled during today's countdown. And we're now streaming audio from SpaceX's launch control team, so you just heard a call out from the Launch Control Center that liquid oxygen loading into the second stage has started. This is the last of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled with fluid during today's countdown. The second stage already full of kerosene. Now inside of 16 minutes to go until liftoff of SpaceX's Transporter 4 rideshare flight. Now passing T-minus 13 minutes and counting, this will be the 146th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since the launch vehicle's first mission back in 2010. Also, it's the 154th launch of the Falcon rocket family that includes Falcon 1 and Falcon Heavy rockets since 2006. And the booster flying today is making its 7th flight. This reusable rocket has flown 6 times before, including on 2 crew flights, hauling astronauts into space on the way to the International Space Station. It's the 83rd Falcon 9 rocket launch from Pad 40, 138th launch overall from Pad 40, dating back to the 1960s when the launch facility was originally constructed for the Air Force's Titan rocket program. As I mentioned before, this is the 4th Transporter small satellite rideshare mission for SpaceX, and it's the 12th Falcon 9 launch of the year, and the first of the first of 6 Falcon 9 launches SpaceX is currently planning for the month of April, and it's the 13th flight out of Cape Canaveral, rocket flight out of Cape Canaveral so far in 2022. This chart shows some of the flight history from Booster 1061. Its first 2 missions were crew flights for NASA back in November 2020 and April 2021. And since then, it's flown 4 additional missions with the SiriusXM radio satellite last June. the CRS-23 cargo mission to the space station last August, and the IXPE X-ray astronomy satellite for NASA on December 9th. Most recently, it flew on February 3rd with a batch of Starlink internet satellites for SpaceX's global broadband network. Now 11 minutes left in the countdown. Everything looking good for an on-time launch of the Falcon 9 rocket at 12:24 p.m. Eastern Time, or 16:24 UTC. In fact, this has been the target launch date for this mission for a couple of months now, and the launch has remained on schedule for April 1st. Again, liftoff targeted for exactly 12:24 p.m. and 17 seconds Eastern Daylight Time. That's 16:24 UTC. The countdown just past 7 minutes at this time. The process to thermally condition the Merlin engines at the bottom of the Falcon 9 rocket is underway. This is known as engine chill down. It's when SpaceX begins flowing small amounts of super cold liquid oxygen through some of the engine components and plumbing. It conditions those components for the shock of that super cold oxidizer as it begins flowing at high rate once those engines ignite. to make sure those components are ready for that shock of that cold oxidizer during flight. Now approaching the T-minus 6 minute mark.
Stage 1, RP1 load complete.
SpaceX confirms the RP1 load into the Stage 1 tank has completed. This means that the Falcon 9 is fully loaded with around 46,000 gallons of RP1, which is a rocket-grade kerosene, feeding the Merlin engines on the first and second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. Liquid oxygen, which is chilled a few hundred degrees below zero, continues flowing into the rocket until around T-minus 2 minutes or so to ensure that those tanks are full and topped off at flight level before liftoff. The oxygen does vent out of those tanks at a slow rate due to the ambient warm temperatures here in Florida. So SpaceX continues to top off those tanks until the final moments before launch.
Tanks are pressing for strong back retract. Strong back retract has started.
In this view, you're about to see the strong back structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 rocket beginning to move away from the vehicle. You can see it now. The clamps have opened. The strong back is retracting to a position just about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9. That's the position that will remain in for the rest of the countdown. Once the Falcon 9 is released for liftoff, that strong back will swing away a greater distance from the rocket to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb into the skies over Cape Canaveral. Now, less than 3.5 minutes to go. In the past few minutes, SpaceX's launch team and the Falcon 9's automated countdown sequencer has checked to ensure that the rocket's automated flight safety system is ready for flight. This is the system that would destroy the rocket if it flew off course and threatened any people or property during today's climb to space. The guidance system on the Falcon 9 rocket has, in the past few minutes, also been verified ready to go.
Stage 1 LOX load complete.
Now less than 3 minutes left in the countdown.
Stage 2 LOX load complete.
The Falcon 9 is now confirmed fully loaded with liquid oxygen and kerosene. It weighs about 1.2 million pounds, and 1 million of those pounds consist of that propellant. Less than 200,000 pounds is actually made up of the structure of the rocket itself. Now approaching T-minus 60 seconds. At this point, the Falcon 9 will be transitioned to internal power.
Gas close. That's started.
About a minute to go on internal power. The onboard computer now has control of the countdown. The Falcon 9 propellant tanks will be pressurized for flight. 40 seconds. Fifteen seconds to go.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
T-minus 10 seconds. And ignition and liftoff of the Falcon 9, carrying 40 spacecraft to orbit
Falcon
for
9
the Transporter 4 Rideshare mission, heading to polar orbit from Cape Canaveral, Florida.
T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Falcon 9 has
Mission and liftoff
flown into
of
some
Transporter
clouds over
4.
Cape Canaveral. Everything looking good so far in the flight. A big rumble now passing over the spaceport here in Florida.
Pitching downrange.
Everything looking good. Now a minute into the
Stage
flight.
1 chamber pressure is nominal.
We're now switching to SpaceX's feed of the launch, which is actually on a bit of a latency delay. Their stream does have a bit of a delay. This shows a replay of the Falcon 9 launch moments ago. We'll follow this broadcast through the rest of the flight now that the Falcon 9 has passed into the clouds.
Power and telemetry
T plus
nominal.
1 minute 30 seconds. Again, this shows a delayed view of the launch about a minute and a half ago.
Mach 1.
Onboard camera showing the Falcon 9 climbing through those clouds, heading downrange. Now T plus 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Again, this SpaceX stream over a minute delayed, showing onboard views from just a few moments ago as the Falcon 9 climbed through the sky.
Start of MVAC engine chill. Main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
MVAC ignition.
There you see a view from onboard cameras showing MECO, main engine cutoff, and stage separation. On the right, you see the second stage's Merlin vacuum engine firing On the left, you see a down-facing view from an onboard camera on the first stage booster showing the hypersonic grid fins now popping open to begin controlling the first stage's descent back into the atmosphere. And there's payload fairing separation with the Falcon 9 now in space. The payload shroud has jettisoned to reveal those 40 spacecraft to space for the first time. Now approaching T+6 minutes, everything looking good on both the first stage and the second stage. On the left side, you can see a view of the first stage looking down. That's some of the beautiful ocean color near the Bahamas. It's heading toward the drone ship. Just read the instructions. Parked between Cuba and the Bahamas, around 330 miles or 530 kilometers downrange from the Cape. Now nearly 8 minutes into the flight. The first stage landing is expected at T+10 minutes and 26 seconds, so around 2.5 minutes from now. Coming up on the entry burn on the first stage, you'll see that from an onboard view on the left side of the split screen when 3 of the Merlin engines reignite to begin slowing the Falcon 9 booster for its descent back into the atmosphere. The Falcon 9 first stage now at an altitude of 113 kilometers and falling fast. The second stage continues firing on the right side of this screen with its Merlin vacuum engine generating around 220,000 pounds of thrust, burning that kerosene and liquid oxygen that was loaded on board during the countdown. Now approaching 600 kilometers on stage 2, heading for an altitude of around 650 kilometers to begin deploying the first batch of spacecraft on today's Rideshare flight. That entry burn now underway. On the left, you can see those engines, the exhaust from those engines appearing. You can see that speed really beginning to decrease as the Falcon 9 falls back into the atmosphere, heading for a location between Cuba and the Bahamas. Beautiful watercolors there from the Atlantic Ocean near the Bahamas. The drone ship parked down there, waiting for the arrival of the Falcon 9 booster number 1061 on its 7th flight. We've heard confirmation of SECO 1. That means the second stage has cut off. You'll see that happening in this view shortly. This view, again, delayed a few seconds. There is engine cutoff in this onboard camera view, and SpaceX has confirmed a good orbital insertion. There's the first stage making its landing on Just Read the Instructions, completing its 7th trip to space on today's flight. 7 missions in the books for Booster 1061. now plus 16 minutes since liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. At this point, the first of the 40 spacecraft on board should have deployed. However, SpaceX says the Falcon 9 is flying out of communications range right now. This is as expected after flying over the horizon from Cape Canaveral. It's in a region without any ground station coverage. SpaceX expects to recapture telemetry from the Falcon 9 once it's passing over a ground station in the Maldives at T plus 57 minutes. That's around 40 minutes from now. And at that point, SpaceX expects to confirm that Germany's InMap environmental mapping satellite, as well as two other smaller co-passengers, did successfully deploy from the Falcon 9. All that should be happening around this time. That'll be followed by a brief 1 or 2 second burn of the Falcon upper stage engine at around 28 minutes after liftoff to begin maneuvering the rocket into a slightly lower orbit at about 500 kilometers altitude. And then again, SpaceX expects to recapture telemetry from the Falcon 9, regain communications coverage at T plus 57 minutes. Another upper stage burn is planned at T plus 1 hour 8 minutes to complete those orbital adjustments for the separation of the final batch of 37 spacecraft in that lower orbit. So T plus 18 minutes and 40 seconds now. Those first 3 satellites should have separated at this point. We're now showing you a timeline of today's mission. The upper part of the mission has already been accomplished with the first stage and second stage burns, as well as the first stage landing, all successfully. And in the past few minutes, the first 3 payloads on today's mission, consisting of Germany's InMap environmental mapping satellite, and the Leo 1 and Gnomes 3 small sats, should have deployed from the Falcon 9, but again, the Falcon 9 is currently outside of communications range, not in range of a ground station. At T plus 57 minutes, SpaceX expects to regain communications with the Falcon 9 upper stage, and telemetry stored on the rocket will then confirm that the Falcon 9 did in fact deploy those first 3 payloads and completed its second engine burn. And that'll be followed by a third burn of the upper stage engine, and then resumption of the payload deployment sequence at T plus 1 hour and 14 minutes. And over the course of around 12 minutes or so, the remaining 37 spacecraft will be deployed from the Falcon 9 payload stack. Again, this mission designated Transporter 4. It's the 4th dedicated small satellite rideshare flight for SpaceX's Transporter program. This one carrying 40 spacecraft to orbit after previous missions carried larger numbers of spacecraft to orbit. However, this mission is unique in that it carries InMap, which is a 1-ton spacecraft, much larger than any of the rideshare payloads carried on any of the previous Transporter flights. Now 20 minutes after liftoff, the upper stage, as you can see in this map, is over the Pacific Ocean, passing west of, west of Peru, and will soon be passing west of Chile, heading south over the Pacific. It'll be passing over Antarctica and then heading north over the Indian Ocean, and telemetry will be regained at the Maldives ground station at T plus 57 minutes. That'll be around 1:21 p.m. Eastern Time. We just heard moments ago that the Falcon 9 has briefly passed in range of a ground station in Chile, allowing the team at SpaceX Launch Control to confirm that the first 3 payloads in today's mission have deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. Those first 3 satellites included the INMAP spacecraft from the German Aerospace Center, or DLR. Also 2 smaller payloads named Leo 1 and GNOMES 3 also deployed. GNOMES 3 is a small satellite to collect atmospheric data for the startup company called Planet IQ based in Colorado. The Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage is now going through its chill down conditioning process to thermally prepare the engine for a brief restart. This restart will last just a couple of seconds, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin lowering its orbit from its current altitude of 657 kilometers. It'll be heading down to an orbit with an average altitude of around 500 kilometers. It'll be using 2 burns of the Merlin vacuum engine to accomplish that. This first burn to adjust the orbit planned to begin at T plus 28 minutes and 8 seconds, a little over a minute away. A second burn coming at T plus 1 hour and 8 minutes. That'll set the stage for deployment of the remaining 37 spacecraft on this Rideshare mission. We've just heard confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that Merlin engine ignition and shutdown did occur. You'll see it here in this video feed. A few seconds delayed. And there's that burn. The Merlin vacuum engine firing for just 1 or 2 seconds. That'll allow the low point of this orbit to be lowered down to around 500 kilometers. And once now that the rocket is in that transfer orbit, the rocket will coast for another 40 minutes or so before reigniting the Merlin vacuum engine for another very short burn to circularize the orbit and set the stage for deployment of the rest of the payloads on today's mission. Now, 31 minutes into the mission, the Falcon 9 continues coasting in space. It is about to pass over Antarctica and then head north out over the Indian Ocean. 37 payloads still on board the Falcon 9. The first 3 spacecraft have already deployed in the initial orbit of around 650 kilometers. Those satellites consisted of 2 small satellites named Leo 1 and Gnomes 3. And the biggest payload of today's mission, named Nmap, also has successfully separated from the Falcon 9. That occurred at T+14 minutes. It was the first of the 40 spacecraft to be released from the Falcon 9's payload stack. This footage shows the Nmap spacecraft during testing in Germany. This spacecraft was built by the company OHB for DLR. DLR is the German Aerospace Center, a German space agency. This spacecraft weighs around 2,160 pounds or 980 kilograms. It's about the size of a compact car. It's the biggest spacecraft that's ever flown on one of SpaceX's Rideshare missions, and in fact, the Nmap mission was originally supposed to fly as a dedicated ride on either an Indian PSLV rocket or a European Vega rocket. However, SpaceX was available for the ride at the right time, at the right cost, and the German Space Agency took that opportunity and flew the mission on today's Rideshare Transporter 4 Rideshare flight. This is an Earth observation spacecraft with a hyperspectral Earth imaging sensor with 2 spectrometers sensitive to visible and near-infrared light. And this instrument on the spacecraft can measure reflections of light off Earth's surface in 242 different channels or colors. Allows scientists to see details about the ground surfaces, allows researchers to look at the health of plants in crops and forests, and also can help scientists monitor water pollution as well as the effects of fertilizer on water runoff. So a lot of science coming out of this mission. The mission, according to Sebastian Fischer, the mission manager, who I was able to speak to yesterday, costs around 300 million euros or $330 million. And it's going to be launching on a 5-year mission in Earth orbit. This shows some of the major components of the Nmap spacecraft. The launch adapter there on the left is the attachment point where the spacecraft was fitted to the top of the Transporter 4 payload stack. On the lower right is that telescope assembly. That's those are the optics that will be looking down at Earth. And on top is the spacecraft's fixed solar panel to generate electricity while the spacecraft is in orbit. German ground controllers expect to receive the first telemetry from Nmap around an hour from now when it passes over a ground station in Svalbard, which is part of Norway in the Arctic Ocean. At that point, German ground teams will be able to confirm the health of the spacecraft. It'll be commissioned and readied for service and begin operations around 6 months after launch. The data from Nmap will be shared free of charge around the world, according to the German Space Agency. Again, this spacecraft designed to reveal Earth's surfaces in greater detail than most Earth observation missions. Again, it's sensitive to 242 channels of light, breaking the spectrum of light into 242 different individual components, allowing scientists to see greater detail of the health of plants, as well as monitoring what plants need to be watered, what plants need to be fertilized, all data that's useful for farmers, policymakers, scientists, and other applications. Now, a little more than 35 minutes into the mission, you can see in this map the upper stage now flying over Antarctica. The next major event will be the restart of the second stage engine for its 3rd burn at T+1 hour and 8 minutes. So that's a little over 33 minutes away from this point. So we'll pause our commentary for a few minutes now as we await the next major step in today's mission, setting up for separation of 37 more small spacecraft in polar orbit. Hello again, this is Stephen Clark from Spaceflight Now reporting live from Kennedy Space Center. Just a quick update on the status of today's mission. We just heard confirmation from SpaceX's launch control team that the Merlin vacuum engine on stage 2 has completed its third burn rather. This was the third burn of the Merlin upper stage engine, lasted about 1 second. The Falcon 9 now at an altitude of about 507 kilometers, and SpaceX just confirmed that the rocket has achieved its planned orbit for the final deployment of the Transporter 4 payloads. 37 spacecraft will be released from the Falcon 9 over the next 20 minutes or so. Those satellites will be released one by one from the Falcon 9 payload stack. The rocket now passing over India, heading north. So those payloads are due to begin deploying in about 5.5 minutes or so. Some of those early deployments may be when the Falcon 9 is outside the range of ground stations. And the last of the 40 payloads is expected to be released from the Falcon 9 rocket at T+1 hour and 26 minutes. That's about 17 minutes from now. So the remaining 37 payloads will be released over a period of around 12 minutes or so. Now T plus 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 47 seconds. At this time, the payload deployment sequence should be resuming. 37 more spacecraft still to be deployed from the Falcon 9 payload stack on the Transporter 4 mission. However, right now the Falcon 9 is passing over, looks like passing over southern Russia, outside the range of any ground stations. It's now just passed outside the reach of ground sites in India and as well as in Dubai. So right now there's a communications blackout as expected from the Falcon 9 until it passes over the North Pole region and back in range of a ground station in a few minutes. And at that point we should hear confirmation that the first of this next batch of payloads has successfully been released from the Falcon 9 rocket. These spacecraft being released come from a number of customers. They include 5 NewSat Earth observation satellites from a company called Satellogic based in Argentina. They also include 3 microsatellites from Hawkeye 360, which is a company based in Virginia that is building out a fleet of small satellites to help geolocate radio frequency emissions. And Hawkeye 360's customers include the U.S. military as well as other clients in the commercial and government sectors. The rocket will also be deploying 12 pico satellites, which are about the size of a slice of bread. These come from Swarm Technologies, which is a subsidiary of SpaceX, providing a low data rate communications for commercial customers. Another spacecraft that should have deployed by now is called ArcSat. It's developed for the research arm of the Norwegian military, providing a demonstration of UHF tactical communications over the North Sea and the Arctic Ocean region. There's also a satellite on board for an Indian startup named Pixel, providing Earth imagery. Other satellites on board come from the Czech Republic, from Brazil, and from a French startup named Unseen Labs, which is launching its Bro 7 spacecraft on today's mission to provide maritime surveillance services. So now T plus 1 hour, 17 minutes, and 40 seconds. At this point, the first 10 spacecraft on the Transporter 4 mission should have separated. We hope to get confirmation of that in a few minutes once the Falcon 9 is back in range of a ground station. The Falcon 9 is now back in range of a ground station in Svalbard, which is in the Arctic Ocean, part of a Norwegian territory. And SpaceX has now received telemetry from the rocket confirming 9 additional separation events have occurred successfully. These included the Norwegian military's ArcSat UHF telecommunications demonstration satellite, as well as a university-built CubeSat from Brazil, 12 swarm internet or low data rate communication satellites, as well as an Earth observation satellite for the Indian company Pixel, a CubeSat from the Czech Republic, and a CubeSat from the French company Unseen Labs. You're now looking at a live view from an onboard camera. This imagery being relayed through a ground station in Norway and on the island of Svalbard. So in this view, you may see some of these payload separation events occur over the next few minutes. SpaceX has now confirmed that all 5 NewSat Earth observation satellites for Satellogic, this is the Argentine Earth observation company, have separated. You're continuing to see live views from an onboard camera aboard the Falcon 9 rocket looking up or forward along the payload stack. Most of the spacecraft have now deployed. Just a few more separation events to go. We've heard confirmation that all 5 NewSat Earth imaging satellites from Satellogic are off the rocket, as well as all 3 Hawk satellites for the company Hawkeye 360 have now deployed. Now you've seen that all of the satellites have now deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. The last 2 were the Link Tower 1 spacecraft for the company Link Global, which is developing a network in low Earth orbit. So you saw the last 2 satellites deploy, which were Link Tower 1 for the company Link Global, which is developing a network of satellites in low Earth orbit to connect with unmodified standard cell phones to provide connectivity for broadband and messaging services. And the last spacecraft to deploy was a CubeSat carrier vehicle for the company D-Orbit. It's an Italian company. And that spacecraft is actually hosting a cluster of 7 CubeSats that it will be deploying by itself now that it's flying free of the Falcon 9 over the next few weeks. It'll be releasing those CubeSats over the next few weeks into their own orbit. So with that, 40 spacecraft have been successfully delivered to a polar sun synchronous orbit today by SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. These satellites are beginning missions for communications, technology demonstrations, and Earth observations. And the customers and owners of these satellites over the next few hours and days will be trying to establish contact with their spacecraft to make sure they're healthy and they're alive and ready to begin their missions over the next few months and years. Everything looks like the flight went by the book today with everything in the correct orbit. The Falcon 9 placed the first 3 spacecraft, including Germany's NMAP hyperspectral imaging satellite, into an initial orbit around 650 kilometers or roughly 400 miles above Earth, and then lowered its orbit down to around 310 miles or about 500 kilometers for the separation of the remaining 37 spacecraft. And the Falcon 9 is now expected to perform a deorbit burn with its Merlin vacuum engine later today to ensure that the rocket does not remain in orbit and become a risk for creating space junk. So with today's Falcon 9 mission now complete, you're looking now at a live view of Pad 39B, a few miles to the north of Pad 40, where today's mission originated. And on Pad 39B, NASA's Space Launch System is preparing for a dress rehearsal over the weekend. On Sunday, the rocket will be loaded with super cold liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen cryogenic propellants. That'll be the first time the fully integrated, fully stacked Space Launch System will be loaded with fuel on the launch pad. This is all in preparation for launch in the June timeframe, no earlier than June 6th, of a NASA's Artemis 1 test flight around the moon. This will pave the way for future Artemis flights carrying astronauts back to the moon and eventually landing on the lunar surface. So that's the next major event here on Florida Space Coast. The countdown for the wet dress rehearsal, so-called, of the Space Launch System is scheduled to begin around 5 p.m. Eastern Time today, a little over 3 hours from now, and that countdown will run for nearly 2 full days, culminating in cryogenic tanking of the rocket on Pad 39B Sunday morning. And then the launch team inside the Launch Control Center here at Kennedy Space Center will run the rocket through a terminal countdown. In fact, it'll run through 2 flows through the terminal countdown, and ultimately will cut the countdown at T-minus 9.3 seconds or so, just before ignition of the main engines at the bottom of that core stage. This is intended as an exercise to make sure that all systems on the rocket, all systems on the giant mobile launch tower next to the rocket you see in this view, are all ready for the real launch day. Also serves as a rehearsal for the launch team, all in, to ensure all is in readiness for the Artemis 1 launch attempt. NASA is expected to set a target launch date for the Artemis 1 launch after the wet dress rehearsal. However, right now the launch is not expected to occur before June 6th. We'll have coverage of that wet dress rehearsal on our website over the coming days, as well as a live stream of the Pad 39B, where the Space Launch System is currently standing 322 feet tall throughout the rest of its time on the pad. After the wet dress rehearsal, NASA plans to roll the rocket back inside the vehicle assembly building roughly 8 days or so after the dress rehearsal. And inside the VAB, the rocket will be inspected. The ground crews will test the rocket's flight termination system. This is the destruct charges these are the destruct charges that would destroy the rocket if it veered off course or encountered a major problem off the pad. There will be some additional checkouts of various components of the rocket and the Orion spacecraft on top. Some experiments and payloads will be loaded into the Orion crew cabin. And then the rocket will eventually roll back to Pad 39B roughly 6 or 7 days before the actual launch target date. So all that's to come over the weekend. We'll have live coverage of that. In addition to the Space Launch System wet dress rehearsal, we'll be covering a number of launches over the next few weeks. Beginning tomorrow morning, actually, we'll have live coverage on spaceflightnow.com, as well as a live stream of Rocket Lab's Electron rocket launch. That launch is scheduled to occur at 8:10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 12:10 UTC tomorrow, Saturday, from Rocket Lab's privately operated spaceport in New Zealand, carrying 2 small Earth observation satellites for the company Black Sky. Following that, a series of Falcon 9 missions scheduled later this month, beginning next Wednesday, April 6th, with the launch of the Axiom 1 mission. That's the first all-private commercial crew flight to the International Space Station, carrying 3 paying passengers as well as a retired NASA astronaut up to the space station for a flight expected to last about 10 days from liftoff to splashdown on the SpaceX Crew Dragon Endeavour spacecraft. That'll be launching from Pad 39A here at Kennedy Space Center. And then on April 15th, another Falcon 9 is scheduled to launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with a classified payload for the National Reconnaissance Office. That's the U.S. government's spy satellite agency. And on April 20th, another crew flight to the International Space Station, this one for NASA, on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket and Crew Dragon spacecraft, carrying the next long-duration crew up to the space station, also lifting off from Pad 39A just 2 weeks after the Axiom 1 mission. So 2 crew flights to the space station set to blast off from Kennedy Space Center just 2 weeks apart later this month. And then additional launches are scheduled later in April from here at Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. We believe at least 2 more Falcon 9 missions in that last week of April are scheduled from Florida's Space Coast. So we hope you'll join us for these launches later this month, as well as the coverage of the Artemis 1 countdown dress rehearsal this weekend on spaceflightnow.com, as well as on our YouTube stream. Until then, thank you for joining us for the launch of SpaceX's Transporter 4 mission. I'm Stephen Clark, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And if you want to support our coverage, of course, you can go to spaceflightnow.com and go to the top of the homepage to the member section and become a member. And your contributions through the membership program help support our coverage. So we really appreciate any support you can provide in that manner. So until next time, thank you for joining us and have a good afternoon.